Well, should we make a start so that the and other people will join when they do. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Orr, and I'm the Executive Director of Interspill, and I'd like to welcome you to this Interspill Inform shipping and salvage webinar on casualty management. We've got some really interesting speakers. It's a very relevant topic, and there's a lot which will come out of this session, which is being recorded. Could you please put questions that you have into chat, and I'll field them at the end to the speakers, and then at the end of it I will open the floor to everybody who's attending. I just wanted my slides to move on. So the Interspill Inform is a series of webinars to, unsurprisingly, inform our audience of the current topics of interest in advance of the sector-themed days at Interspill in Amsterdam on the 22nd to the 25th, 22nd to the 23rd of June, 22nd to the 25th of June. We've got 3 days. The 21st is ports and harbours, the 22nd is shipping and salvage, and the 23rd is clean seas. Now, these are industry-led events, and they're an opportunity to look at contemporary topics in more detail than the technical conference is able to do. Now, we've got 3 webinars in this series. This is the first, Shipping and Salvage Casualty Management today. We've got a session on container losses on the 7th of June, and one on alternative fuels on the 15th of June. And these set the scene for the day that we'll be having at Interspill. And for more information, you can find it at interspill.org and look for sector-themed days. Casualty management. This is the MV Napoli, which was quite a big incident from which there was a lot of learning and which will be covered in this webinar. But we've more recently seen, this is the MV Express Pearl, and which was less than a year old container ship, which went around and collected containers from various countries or ports in the Indian Ocean. It picked up some containers in one country. It loaded, went to another, loaded, realized that one of the containers had caught fire, tried to go back into one of the ports, but they refused. And then eventually it anchored off Colombo near Sri Lanka, much in the news at the moment, where unfortunately the fire could not be put out and it ended up as a burnt out casualty. And there's a lot of learning which has come out of that, and a lot of questions which perhaps need to be asked about the way casualties can be managed. And in a way, it was a sort of seed for this webinar. So we've got 3 really, really interesting speakers today. Sam Kendall Marsden is the Director of Claims for the Standard Club. They're a leading P&I insurer with offices in London, New York, Athens, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. Sam has overall responsible for P&I and defence claims at the club and has special expertise in major casualty management, having handled a number of high-profile wreck removal claims, including the Costa Concordia. Sam is also chair of the International Group's Large Casualty Committee, a cross-club body with a dedicated focus on improving the management of major marine casualties and controlling costs. Secondly, we have Jan de Boer, who is the senior legal officer at the Legal Affairs Office of the Legal Affairs and External Relations Division of the International Maritime Organization. Before joining the UN's Maritime Agency, he served as senior legal counsel at the Netherlands Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. As vice chairman of the IMO Legal Committee, he was involved in numerous international conventions and attended many diplomatic conferences, including on the revision of the CLC and Fund Convention and the HNS Hazardous and Noxious Substances Convention and Protocol. In 2007, he was elected chairman of the Committee of the Whole of the successful International Conference on the Removal of Wrecks in Nairobi, Kenya, which will be a key topic in this webinar. He acted as chairman of the signing ceremony of the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Carriage of Goods wholly or partly by sea, the Rotterdam Rules, in September 2019. Jan has a Masters of Law at the University of Amsterdam and International Law at the State University Leiden. And our third speaker will be Stefan Hennig, who is the Secretary of State's representative for Maritime Salvage and Intervention at the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. This is a post that he assumed in May 2018. Prior to that, he was the Deputy SOSREP, and prior to taking that role, he was a counter-pollution and salvage officer for Scotland and Northern Ireland for the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. He clearly has salvage and pollution running through his veins. So they are the three speakers. Please put the questions in chat. I'll host these at the end, and I'll hand over now to Sam.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. I will share my screen. Mark, could you just confirm you can see the opening?
Yeah, that looks great. Yeah.
Slide. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting me to address you this afternoon at this Shipping and Salvage Casualty Management webinar. As Mark has said, my name's Sam Kendall Marsden. I'm Head of Claims for the Standard Club, and I'm also the Chair of the International Group's Large Casualty Committee, which has a dedicated focus on the better management of the large claims that we see across the group. These are the issues that we're going to cover today. I'm going to firstly recap what it is that P&I insurance does, what it covers. We'll then talk about casualty response. That's the core of this presentation. Dig into that in a little bit more detail in terms of what P&I insurance and also what hull and machinery insurance do in the context of a casualty. We'll then provide a little bit more texture by going through a brief case study, the Costa Concordia. That will be a big enough case to occupy probably a whole day on its own, but we'll explore a few discrete features of a casualty that I'm intimately involved in and have been for over the last 10 years. And then lastly, we'll wrap up and talk about international group outreach, the work that we do engaging with maritime states, including the UK, and we're very fortunate to have Stefan here with us today. So just a brief recap in relation to P&I then. What is a P&I club? The P&I clubs have been around for quite a while. You can see there back to the 1850s, and a P&I club is a mutual insurer owned and controlled by ship owner members. So we don't exist to make a profit for shareholders. Our sole focus is to support and serve our ship owner members. And the day-to-day operations of the clubs are delegated to club managers, people like me, who handle day-to-day operations either on the underwriting side or in relation to claims, which has been my focus since I started at the club 14 years ago. And we're supported by an extensive network of correspondents. These are our eyes and ears on the ground and people with a lot of expertise in casualty and other claim management based in the major ports around the world who support us in the event of an incident involving a club member. These are the member clubs of the international group. The international group comprises 13 P&I clubs, of which Standard Club is one of those clubs. And there are 12 others. You'll see their names there. The P&I clubs cover all types and sizes of ships. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see bulk carriers, container ships, small craft, cruise ships, fishing boats, and actually it's about 90% of the world's ocean-going fleet, over 65,000 individual ships. So the chances are that if you have an incident involving an ocean-going ship, that you're going to be dealing with a P&I club. And the clubs insure not just ship owners I've mentioned, but also charterers, people who hire a ship either for a particular voyage charterers, or a period of time charterers, and a whole host of other people involved in shipping. The people that manage a ship's technical operations, the technical managers, those who manage crewing, and also the commercial managers, a whole raft of particular interests. What I'm going to do now is just go through some casualties that we've experienced at the Standard Club. This is the MSC Chitra. This was a container ship that was involved in a collision and ran aground in 2010, and that led to an extensive wreck removal operation that the club supported, and also pollution liabilities as well. Leakage of bunker fuel in that particular case, fouling nearby mangroves off Mumbai in India. Moving on a year, another container ship, the Rena, this one in New Zealand, off the port of Taranga. This was a grounding, so another navigational incident, slightly different to a collision though. Moving forward, 2012, 13th of January, Friday the 13th, the Concordia, which ran aground off the west coast of Italy in the Tyrrhenian Sea. So again, another navigational issue. And then lastly, 2018, March, the Maersk Honam, a different type of casualty this time, so another container ship, but this was a fire on board the ship. And what links all of these things is that they're all casualties, all shipping casualties, albeit involving some different ship types. If we go back to the Rena, there's an interesting question here about when a ship becomes a casualty. And what can you see in that photograph? I mentioned earlier the Rena ran aground on a reef, and you can actually see the reef there towards the bow section of the ship. You can see a number of different container stacks have collapsed, and cargo's about to enter the sea, as we all know. In terms of the initial notification, though, of the Rena, you can see initially there was a reference to the ship striking a reef off Taranga. So on its own, not quite sure whether that might be a grounding that can be rectified or something that develops further. But as further news emerged, the ship was on a 12-degree list, cargo holds flooded, so the situation was worse. And it's about deciding how serious a particular casualty is. And we know in the case of the Rena, it became very serious, and that became a very large wreck removal for the group and had an impact on the local population in New Zealand. So what is it that we want ship owners and other stakeholders to be doing in terms of the initial casualty response? That initial notification is vitally important because it goes to the priorities that we're looking at in the early stages of an incident. And really there are three things here. You've got people, you've got the environment, and you've also got property, and it's about safeguarding those things. And so the first stage in a casualty situation is typically salvage. The ship owner wants to do all that they can in order to rescue the situation and prevent injury, prevent loss of life, prevent damage to the environment, and protect property, and ultimately put their asset, the ship, back into service. And there's a really important question here about how to act from a legal perspective. And there's a debate that's been going on in industry for some time about the Lloyd's open form salvage contract that people may have heard about. We think within the group that Lloyd's open form is a perfect contract for an emergency situation because it allows the master to contract for salvage services without delay. And the consequences of delay are often that a situation can get worse in relation to the priorities that I've mentioned. Whereas if swift action can be taken, then actually the risks of environmental damage in particular can be mitigated. So it's important to act prudently and properly, and the Lloyd's open form contract allows a party to do that. But unfortunately, what we've seen is a decline in the use of Lloyd's open form over a period of time, and we're keen to understand why that is. And so through the international group, we've engaged Hugh Shaw, the former SOS rep in the UK, to spearhead a project examining the reasons why people might not select Lloyd's open form as a contract. Because If they don't go down that route in an emergency situation and try to negotiate another form of contract, that can take time, lead to delay, and lead to further problems. And I'll just touch on one final point here, the importance of securing a port or place of refuge if a ship is in danger. And again, if a ship is denied refuge, then that too can lead to a situation worsening. There are IMO guidelines in relation to ports of refuge, and work's been done within the EU also on that topic, and that's work that the international group has contributed to. So how does it all fit together, and how do the insurers respond to these particular types of claim? The main types of insurance we're talking about here are protection and indemnity, P&I, and hull and machinery. P&I clubs cover third-party liabilities, and in the context of casualties, the main liabilities that we're talking about here are wreck removal, pollution, loss of life or personal injury, damage to property, so that might be docks, wharves, dolphins, that sort of thing, but it might also be coral reefs, the seabed, and also damage arising out of collision. So these are third-party liabilities, things that come at the ship owner from the outside. We don't cover certain things, including at the bottom of that slide, hull and machinery liabilities. So what do the hull and machinery insurers cover? In addition to physical loss or damage to the ship's hull and its machinery, and a proportion of a ship's collision liability, crucially in this particular context, hull and machinery insurers, as well as cargo insurers, contribute to salvage. Under a Lloyd's Open Form salvage contract, the salvage award is calculated in accordance with the Salvage Convention. There are a number of criteria in there that a salvage arbitrator will look at in determining the award, and the award is paid for by property interests, and that will commonly be hull and machinery insurers on behalf of the ship, cargo insurers on behalf of cargo. So they're the ones who are primarily involved in a salvage situation, although P&I, concerned about third-party liabilities, will be focused on things like, for example, risks to people, pollution, and then also if a situation worsens, wreck removal. So in a situation like the Costa Concordia, for example, or like the Rena, or the other cases that we've mentioned, typically the first phase is one of salvage, trying to remedy the situation, salvage the ship, take it to a port or place of refuge, and then ultimately a place of repair. And those salvage costs are commonly paid for by the hull and machinery and cargo underwriters, property interests. There's a slight caveat to that, because the salvage award is capped at the value of the property salved, and an award is only payable if a salvage is successful. So if a salvor is concerned about their prospects of success or the size of the pot available for their salvage award, what they might do is invoke something called the scopic clause, which is something that can be incorporated into a Lloyd's Open Form salvage contract, and that allows them to be remunerated in a different way, and P&I would contribute to that and pay the scopic award on top of an amount assessed in relation to the Article 13 award that I mentioned earlier. But putting that to one side, let's say we've got a salvage situation, and unfortunately it's not successful. You can see there the Costa Concordia lying on its starboard side. You then move from a salvage situation into a wreck removal situation, and there are really three ingredients there. The first is where the ship becomes what's termed a constructive total loss, so colloquially an insurance write-off. The costs of salvage and the costs of repair exceed the insured value. The owner would then commonly abandon the property in the wreck to their hull and machinery underwriters, who typically would reject that notice of abandonment. And the authorities, typically on environmental grounds or because the wreck poses a hazard to navigation. I don't want to steal Jan's thunder. I'm sure he's going to talk about this shortly in the context of the Nairobi Convention. They will issue a wreck removal order, and the owner then has a legal third-party liability to remove the wreck of that ship, and the underlying insurance cover will pass from property, hull and machinery, cargo, through to P&I to respond to the wreck removal. And that's where the clubs really add value, because you'll see the cases that I've mentioned earlier, they're all international group club cases, and the clubs between them have got an awful lot of experience in practical claims handling. So we get involved in casualties, working with the ship owners that we insure and also other consultants in terms of remedying these situations. And we share information that we learn within the group. So within the large casualty committee that I chair, and also the salvage committee, we share information and best practice in relation to casualty management. And we've got a lot of experience and also technical expertise in-house. And where we do need external expertise, we have our correspondents, lawyers, and various other experts who can assist us. And we will put boots on the ground and get out to site to assist where necessary. So if we put this into context, the Costa Concordia, this was the most expensive wreck removal operation to date. The overall exposure for P&I, so the third-party liabilities, about $1.5 billion. Of that, wreck liabilities, over $1 billion. The cost of removing the fuel, the bunkers, $25 million plus. And what this did was to exercise different layers of insurance that we provide within the international group. So currently, it was different when the Costa Concordia occurred. Currently, the first $10 million of any claim is borne by the club, insuring that individual ship. From 10 million up to 100 million, the 13 clubs in the international group share those costs within what's called the pool, the international group pool. Above 100 million and ultimately up to 3.1 billion, the group buys reinsurance called the excess of loss program, and also reinsurance for collective overspill, and that goes up to 3.1 billion. Beyond that, if there are liabilities beyond that, and there never have been liabilities beyond that to date, the clubs have the ability to turn to their members and ask for further money in order to respond. There's a formula that determines how those contributions are calculated, but the total extent of cover would be in the region of about $8 billion. So you can see it's an incredibly broad and deep cover that can respond to the biggest shocks like the Costa Concordia. And essentially what we're able to do in order to remedy the situation there, once the emergency phase had taken place with the Italian Coast Guard and others, we moved into a phased approach to get the bunker fuel off first to mitigate the risk of environmental damage, a short caretaking phase while we ran a tender for wreck removal. Once that work had been completed, we then cleared up the debris and sediment on the seabed that had been generated by the work. And we're now into the last phase, which is a site restoration phase. So this involves a team of scientists from the University of Rome restoring the seabed principally by planting coral and Posidonia seagrass, with annual monitoring from the authorities and ongoing liaison with them in between times. We've just had the latest report from the Italian authorities, and they're satisfied with the work that's being done, so that by spring 2024, we're confident that we'll have restored that seabed as best as we possibly can. So it's a successful conclusion, but as I point out there, more work to do. And then just lastly, moving into outreach, one of the other things that we do within the large casualty committee that I'm responsible for is reaching out to maritime states to convey to them that we're responsible insurers that will do the right thing in the event of a major casualty. And this is underpinned by a memorandum of understanding on casualty preparedness and response. And it's partly, and actually most importantly, about getting to know the authorities, so that in the event of an incident, we have those relationships in place already. And I'm very pleased to be saying that actually Stefan, who you're going to be hearing from shortly, is actually sitting right opposite me in this room as we speak now. So as I said, preparedness on the one hand, so sharing information, supporting training initiatives and engaging in lessons learned. And then in the event of an incident, early contact with people that we know, sharing information and making sure that the salvage and wreck response is effective in the event of one of these incidents. So that, Mark, provides a summary of what we do within the clubs and what the clubs provide. And I think we're having questions at the end.
Yeah, we are. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. That's really interesting, Sam. Do you want to unshare and then Jan can jump on?
Well, thank you, Mark, and most for all, Sam, for your very elusive explanation of the involvement of the P&I and home and machine insurance. Topics that will also form part of my own presentation that I would like now to share with the audience. Yeah, it's my sincere pleasure actually to enlighten you about the 2007 Nairobi wreck removal convention. I would like to explain about how that convention works and also to provide you with some updates. This convention actually has been the longest standing agenda item in the International Maritime Organization. And for 37 years, actually, it has been discussed. So
we haven't got your slides yet, Jan.
Oh, so they're not there?
No, not yet, not there yet.
But I'm sharing with you, or
no, we haven't got your slides yet.
But do I share my screen with you or not?
Yeah, no, we haven't got your.
Okay,
we haven't
then
got your
I
screen
go.
yet.
I return back because I have it all here. So that's quite remarkable because. Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah, you just need to click on slide.
Yeah. Sorry,
no, that's all right. No, it's
dropped over. I'm too fast. Sorry for that. So, longest issue on the IMO agenda. So there we go.
That's lovely.
Yes, and I would like to enlighten you about what this convention is all about. To clarify actually what the primary aim is, well, it is to actually to clarify rights, duties and responsibilities related to an effective removal of hazardous wrecks beyond the territorial sea. How the convention works, but also about the scope of application regarding to which geographical areas the convention applies, to which concerns of safety and environmental issues the convention applies, to which ships, which wrecks, but also what criteria are there for actually determining that there is a hazard posed by wrecks, because actually that issue is triggering the application of the convention foremost. Also an issue which might temper somewhat all the expenses of the P&I clubs that Sam has been alluded to, that there is a concept of limitation of liability. So states cannot always have the full recovery of all costs involved, because there might be other rules of IMO actually setting a cap on those costs involved. And of course, I would like to explain somewhat about history and role of IMO. I myself became involved in this project in 1990. I was then 2 years working in the Ministry of Transport in the Netherlands. And I was asked actually how to procure that project of wreck removal. It was already for 20 years on the agenda, how to complete that. Well, it took another 17 years. I have with much pleasure we working for 17 years on this regime, and I like to enlighten you about it, but not before I explained the role of IMO in international shipping. The mission of IMO is to provide for safe, secure, efficient shipping on clean oceans. Having in mind that 90% of global trade is actually carried out by ships, that ownership management embrace many different countries, And apart from that, ships spent also their life between many different jurisdictions and often far away from the state of registry, which makes that shipping is so international that you really need to have common shared international standards to regulate all of that. And that's actually the big success factor for IMO, because IMO was established in 1948, came in force 10 years later, and has produced binding conventions, about 56 or even more. It's a very technical and productive organization with really binding rules for shipping. So that's the explanation for the central role of IMO in the maritime world. It's also the only United Nations agency headquartered in London. It has a, in comparative sense, a rather low budget. It's 30 million pounds a year. It's full secretariat, 265 staff. But the whole philosophy of IMO actually that the organization is the member states. So the secretary is also then in that sense facilitating the member states, and all the work is actually also carried out by the member states. So you should really see this as a machinery of all the 175 member states in the organization. And we deal here with about 50 nationalities, so it's really truly international, which has quite some challenges, but it's also very interesting as a platform to work in. So in 2007, the convention actually was established, but the main factor why we have a convention on wreck removal was, and I show now some of older pictures than Sam is doing. This is the Torrey Canyon, stranded in 1967 for the coast of Cornwall, on its way with Middle East oil to Ireland, but it's hit a rock and stranded outside of the territorial waters of the United Kingdom, and had a discharge of oil that has not been seen as a scale before in history. So it was really a major thing. And I still myself remember when I was 5 years old, actually watching this on television. So that was my first imaginary of tankers. Quite remarkable to remember that. So this big incident made actually a call upon the international community to make regulation, because the ship was outside of territorial waters, so nobody knew actually who was actually entitled to take measures. Also, the oil was affecting not only the United Kingdom, but also France. And on top of that, the pollution, it was also not possible to stop the discharge. So there were even strikes being carried out by the Royal Air Force, actually all in the void what to do to stop this. That made it really a big event, for which there was a major conference organized in Brussels in 1969, which adopted two legal documents. First is the 69 Civil Liability Convention. And I mentioned this because this is a foundation convention for all kind of convention within IMO being established. I explained that, but also the Intervention Convention dealing with public law issues relating to intervention powers across the state beyond territorial sea was actually being concluded. But as we will see, this convention was not sufficient actually to deal with all kinds of wreck removal issues. Also, already in the conference in 1969, it was decided that issues not only relating to the persistent oil carriage, but also the carriage of hazardous noxious substances, and also wreck removal should be dealt with in a later stage. There was even a proposal by the government of Liberia, the flag state of the Torrey Canyon, to have then already specifically a regime being established for wreck removal. Now, on top of these developments, I will explain that in the convention of 1969, there's strict liability for damage caused by spills of heavy crude oils. It's very important. You don't have to prove fault. So this system can rather be speedily and efficiently being invoked without having very lengthy legal proceedings. It's sufficient to actually to demonstrate that there was damage caused by a certain ship and that the damage was actually caused by those substances on board. That's sufficient actually to trigger this whole mechanism. It's very successful. Also because there is a direct action. If the ship owner has become bankrupt, insolvent, the insurer, the P&I club in this sense, and explained the third-party liability is covered by P&I cover, is actually the fallback for an insolvent ship owner. So there's a guarantee that up to the limits of liability, come to that further, there is sufficient cover. In the 69 Intervention Convention, we're relating actually to imminent threats of pollution. There were coastal state powers being established, but these were not actually relating to ordinary wreck removal cases in which you have not this imminent threat of major catastrophic damage. So all the time there was really a void in having a regime. And then in 71, there was a big incident in front of, again, the United Kingdom coastline, close to Folkestone, as I understand. There was a collision between a relatively small freighter from Peru with an enormous unladen oil tanker, the Texaco Caribbean, on the flag of Panama. And that actually caused an enormous explosion. And what I understand is it was 5 miles out of the coast from Folkestone that there all the windows shattered. It was a really major catastrophe. But on top of that, this ship, well, after it exploded, it sunk. But then the next day, it was already been hit by another ship, which actually then collided and sunk. And also, later on, a larger coaster from Germany 2 months later collided. And in total, there were loss of life of 51 persons. So that this made actually the catalyzer that there should be a regime on wreck removal being included in IMO. And also that issues relating to what is a hazard as a wreck and how it creates liability should be established. I mentioned 71. That was also the year that actually negotiations started for a new international convention on the law of the sea. And actually, when the work started in IMO relating to the convention, a new convention, there were struggles about how intervention on which zones should be established. And actually, the interest of states can so be very different. In the Netherlands, for example, what is important is, I hope you see my cursor, the territorial sea is rather a very restricted zone in comparison with actually the larger exclusive economic zone of the Netherlands. And all the major shipping lanes go not through the territorial waters, but to waters beyond territorial seas. So for the Netherlands, it was very clear that there should be a regime regarding wreck removal in very shallow waters relating to a zone outside of the territorial sea. Well, I can tell you that there were many coastal states who were adamant against such an approach, and that actually led to a lot of delay in these negotiations. That's why it took 20 years when I started actually to achieve a solution. A solution has finally, and I don't dwell too much about that, but it has been found in actually a mandatory application in the EZ, and states can opt in also to have an application in the territorial seas. But since P&I cover is available for wreck removals also in this optional approach, there are now many states, even the Netherlands, who didn't show much interest in the start, have also now applied the convention to be applicable in the territorial seas. So there's quite something to gain from this compulsory insurance, for which there are definitely guarantees. So how will the regime work? Because yeah, I happen to be sharing the diplomatic conference, and I would like to tell you a lot about that experience. It was most challenging in my career to do this, but I'll do it at another occasion, and yeah, I hope we will have the opportunity to do that. So how will the convention work? The convention sets the primary responsibility on the ship owner. So there's a kind of unwritten assumption, and it is written, of course, but for the sake of perception, there is a duty by the ship owner actually to take action immediately for the removal when salvage is not successful. That is inherent in the regime. The prime responsibility is the ship owner, and for that, ship owners are free to contract with Salvage or any other person to remove the hazardous wreck on behalf of the ship owner. It has to be established, of course, that a ship is hazardous, the wreck is hazardous. That's the duty of the state. But also the state, when the ship owner is not actually removing, can set a deadline after it has determined that the ship is considered to be hazard. For within the ship has to be removed. The first responsibility is not happening, then the state can act on itself and remove the wreck on the expenses of the ship owner. So the state is the responsible partner for determining whether that hazard exists and also for the marking of the wreck. The ship owner then is under duty to report when there is such an event happening. But also is strictly liable for costs relating to the location, marking, and removal. And that system is actually working on the same footing as the Civil Liability Convention. That's why it's so helpful to have that kind of principle being accepted in all the IMO conventions. It fits all like a glove how to deal with liability issues. So this new regime, 2015 came to force, is not only relating to the navigational concern, but also to environmental concerns. So safety navigation can trigger the application, but also concerns about the marine environment and coastal states and related interests, such as fishing interest, tourism, and you can name it because it's quite open-ended what there might be recoverable under the wreck removal convention. To enlighten you, I saw in Sam's slides with the Costa Concordia wreck removal costs were separated from bunker removal cost. I can understand that, but in the wreck removal convention, there is definitely also a basis to have the recovery of oil, even if carriage in as cargo, but also as bunker oil and lubricating oil, actually to be included in the regime of removal. This is deliberately done so. It might be an overlap with other conventions, but it is deliberately done so because sometimes you already start to actually to work on the basis of the Nairobi Convention. You might find then also have the parties involved already engaged that all damage could be recoverable, but it's left actually to national courts how to divide the allocation of this cost. But in principle, it can all be recoverable under the Nairobi Convention. It can be easy be used, and also since the HNS Convention, for example, is not in force, dealing with the removal also of chemical products, the Nairobi Convention applies. And as I just mentioned, any circumstance that might necessitate the removal of the wreck, so that's in the discretion of the coastal state, might trigger the application of the convention. So as to what wrecks or ships does the convention apply? Well, it applies to sunken and grounded ships, ordinary as it is, but also to objects from ships that are lost at sea. So containers lost at sea from a ship, if you only recover some or one of the containers, that also is recoverable under the wreck removal convention. But it has to be cargo lost at sea, not that a container has lost in a port. It has to really to be lost at sea. Important that place of refuge situations could be applied, because the convention definitely also is applicable to drifting ships in problems. And when there is not effective salvage, that's the terminology being used in the conventions, underway, then the wreck removal steps in, and it can be very useful in those situations which we have seen the place of refuge actually to make use of the intervention powers by the coastal states and to give instructions, because it's all possible under that intervention to manage and to deal with those situations when also place of refuge plays a role. In principle, also applicable to offshore installations, but not when they are fixed and in operation. So fixed platform not, but submersibles and drifting and offshore, it's all actually recoverable. There was even a discussion of having ships, not only ships, but also aircraft being included, because many national jurisdictions do that in the same footing. So situations actually are very genuine. We know the Bowie in New York, in the Hudson, but also in Hong Kong. You have also to remove aircraft. But it was decided to have a similar regime in ICAO, but I've never seen it happening. So it could have been regulated in this convention as well. Flaminia, 2012, it was before or at the time that the small container fire started, and it ended up in somewhat more disastrous circumstances. This could easily fall under the wreck removal, actually, to bring the whole operation to get the ship in safety under the state authority, recoverable also under the regime. I promised about limitation of liability to say some words, and then I will conclude. So limitation of liability is a dimension in the legal aftermath of cost recovery. We have specific limitation conventions. Some of states make reservations regarding removal, say opt for higher limits or even exclude limits. So then you find yourself in restrictions regarding or even unrestricted situations. But the insurance available under the regime, that's quite important, is always kept by the applicable IMO limitation convention. That could be either the 76 with somewhat lower limits than the protocol of 1996 to the same convention. So the insurance is, however, always restricted to the amounts stipulated by the 96 protocol as amended in 2012. It came into force in 2015. So there is always a restriction actually relating to the amounts recoverable from P&I. But in cases that there is no national law applicable, you could potentially have higher claims. What I heard about Costa Concordia, claims of about $1.5 billion. That's far beyond limits of liability. So if the convention applies, P&I Club could have argued, well, we don't feel obliged to pay more, but there must have been reasons with this cruise ship actually to go for a full recovery. And that's something interesting to discuss further, perhaps. I mentioned that civil liability conventions have their own regimes with limits. HNS convention limits for ship owners start at 10 millions of STR, far higher actually than the limitation convention. But also the bunkers convention could simultaneously apply. This is interesting to be resolved in court cases, but it does not stand in the way of a prompt and effective application of the convention. Now, compulsory insurance is restricted to the limits of the 96, so there is a safeguard for the P&I. And yeah, to conclude, that the regime is actually is trying to avoid difficult legal proceedings. It's quite straightforward and a simple convention. It's just 24 articles. It's explains perhaps the relative success of the convention because, apart that the rights, duties, and liabilities are clarified. It's just seen also as a supplementary convention. So it leaves the CLC, the HNS, and the Bugs Convention intact. And the hazard criteria also relate to marine pollution risks. So it's not only a navigational, but definitely also an environmental instrument. It came into force 7 years ago. It has now 60 contracting states. Interesting, this year, the Russian Federation ratified, and actually it's interesting. It was also in the definitely conference that a state like China was very interested in having this extension of coastal state powers. North Korea is also party to the convention, it's for all good reasons because the maybe cases that really need recovery and action. But it is remarkable. But on the other hand, it's also remarkable that there are many states in the European Union that have ratified, and also beyond. The latest is San Marino, not a coastal state. So there must also be other reasons for states actually to ratify. And we still see that the IMO legal committee is urging states to ratify, and also the United Nations General Assembly invites all states actually to become parties. So this is at least somewhat of what I wanted to say, to talk about this afternoon. But I am happy to answer questions on all of that later. I now would like to undo myself from sharing. So where can I find that? And slides. Oh, stop sharing at least.
That's it. Well done, Jan. That was very interesting. I learned a lot on that. That's prompted me to ask a few questions later, but I'll save myself. So I'm dying to hear what Stefan has to say, who must have the coolest job title going, Secretary of State. Oh, magic. Love it. So Stefan, thank you.
Yes, bear with me while I'm trying to share my screen. Can you? You see that?
If you can just click it to slideshow.
Sure.
I think you're there. Yay! Okay. That looks good. Looks very good.
Super. Well, thanks to Mark and Interspill for inviting me to this at, may I say, extremely short notice. So you may forgive the quality of my slides. So I think I've been asked to give a sort of overview of my role, and you can see it there in the top left corner of the window. It's commonly abbreviated to SOSREP because otherwise it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. And it's a role that sits within UK government and is as a bolt-on function to the Maritime Authority, and in the shortest terms deals with UK maritime emergency response. And the role was created in the aftermath of the Sea Empress incident in 1996 of Milford Haven, where let's say there was a lack of clarity in command and control and who should take primacy in their interests, and the incident response somewhat deteriorated after that. And a former judge, Lord Donaldson of Lymington, was asked by UK government to conduct a review of salvage and intervention and their command and control, which he duly did. Donaldson had previously reviewed the response to the Brer grounding just south of the Shetland Islands 3 years prior to the Sea Empress incident. And one of Donaldson's most crucial conclusion was that there should be a single individual representing the Secretary of State and acting in the overriding public interest, because we've heard from Sam and Jan before, there are many interests in an incident, and who's to say one interest is more crucial than the other. But I think when we look at the state perspective, then whatever the response requires should be really done in the overriding public interest. Now, obviously within reason, but without actually looking after a very particular interest. The ship owner will have a completely different interest than, for example, the owner of a mussel farm off the coast, which might be affected. And I think it was billed, Mark, that I work with the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, which is absolutely correct. That's in my day-to-day workings. But the moment I become involved in an incident, I take on an independent role. So I step out of the entire chain of command, and I'm essentially a government authority in my own right, because only that ensures independent decision-making in the process. And the if you will, pressure release valve would be if ministers or government officials weren't content with the way that whoever's in this role manages an incident, then they can remove the legal intervention powers that are vested with this role. I'm happy to report that hasn't happened so far, and I don't intend to let it come to that. When it comes to the role and some of the responsibilities, in the main, it's a government official. The role is an appointed government official who's tasked with monitoring an incident response, plain and simple. So when all parties behave responsibly, and we're talking about different magnitudes of incident here, potential for escalation. Now, obviously, we've seen some of the incidents that, for example, Sam has shown. When you have a grounding of a large container ship, we're past the monitoring stage. I think we're in active involvement territory. So I'm talking more generally here about, low-level incidents which might escalate into something larger. And the whole idea there is that at the earliest opportunity, we open up a potential avenue of state intervention should it be required. In 99% of the cases, I'm happy to report it's not required, because in the main, all the parties involved in incidents behave responsibly. But it's there as a function with powers to prevent something bad from going to worse or catastrophic. And that's, like I said there, the response or state intervention exercised by the SOSREP must be commensurate with the risk. So it's going to be appropriate for the case. And in the main, the moment I start monitoring an incident, whatever happens, a ship needs to fix a piece of machinery, then that's fine. I don't need to be involved in that. I just need to be told that that's happening, and that's what's then called tacit approval. Formal approval would be at the point where we have a wreck or a vessel that's grounded, and there is a response, a salvage response or a wreck removal response that's required, and that would then require a formal plan approval through myself. But I think the key point actually in all of this, now, because all the other steps are technical steps, I think the main point is really stakeholder management, where you have to understand what all the parties, what their interests are and what sort of position they're coming from. Now, and then you need to disappoint them or let them down gently in terms of, we can't really accommodate that interest at that moment in time, but we'll do our best. But the actual intent of resolving this incident through the engagement of the SOSREP role is to, in the interest of safety and in the most safe manner and most environmentally non-damaging manner, remove the risk that's been created through an accident. A few words on the intervention powers. Like I said, the key responsibility is removing or reducing risk to safety. or pollution. And when it says in the job role, the Secretary of State's representative, then it's actually 2 secretaries of state that I can potentially, or that the role can potentially represent. And one is for the Department for Transport, that's in relation to shipping. And another is for the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That rolls off the tongue as well. In the UK, that is the government department that looks after offshore oil and gas exploration and production. And the reason for that is obviously that any ship has a finite amount of pollutants on board, whatever they may be, oil or else. Whereas subsea infrastructure, I think there's the potential for a lot more in terms of pollution than from any one vessel. So I can represent 2 secretaries of state if it's required. And the safety directions that can be issued under the intervention powers, they can be really anything or everything. That is to tell a master to, for example, contract a tug because the ship's been out there for a lengthy amount of time without the crew themselves being able to fix a problem. Or it can also be to go to anchor in a certain position if the situation necessitates it. And the safety directions are really normally issued to the master of a vessel because that's the person most likely to be able to act on it. But it can also be issued to ship owners. And I think Mark, in your one of your messages to me, you'd asked, how can transfer of control, or how can difficult ship owners or reluctant ship owners who don't want to give away control over the response to the incident, how can that transfer of control happen? Well, quite easily through the use of the SOSREP powers. But in the main, the key point is not to have to use them. I think there will always have to be dialogue to resolve an incident as safely as environmentally non-polluting as possible. But the powers of interventions are there if there is disagreement and if there are reluctant parties in the process that may not be following the requirements of the coastal state, as it were. But the use of these powers is contingent on an accident actually occurring to or in a ship. So they can't be used in anticipation. Something has to have happened in or to the vessel, and that can be machinery failure. That is classed in legislation as an accident. So therefore, from that moment onwards, the SOSREP powers would bite. That's just a wee summary of the responsibilities that the role has been given Salvage. That's to oversee salvage on behalf of UK government. That's mainly in relation to shipping. We can obviously have offshore incidents where salvage is involved, but that's a bit rarer. Containment, on the other hand, is more to do with offshore oil and gas. Obviously, containment would also be to stop the flow from tanks of a ship into the sea. It's essentially the prevention of pollution, not the response to it. And both Sam and Jan helpfully mentioned both these next items where places of refuge are concerned. So the SOSREP is the competent authority in the UK to designate a place of refuge for a vessel in need of assistance. And again, that's acting in the overriding public interest. And when it comes to wreck removal, it would be my role that would issue a wreck removal order if we thought that was required. So the UK has a signatory to the Nairobi Convention, and we've applied the convention to both territorial seas and the exclusive economic zones. And the role also gives a limited amount of support to UK maritime security authorities, but that's not something that happens very, very regularly. I just want to give a quick summary over an incident that, in my mind, really tested the system the way it was designed, and that was the MSC Napoli, which encountered structural damage as she was passing through the English Channel, headed westbound towards Portugal, and a crack in the hull grew, and the crew had to be rescued. In the process, salvors went on board the ship to salvage it and to rescue what can be rescued. And a decision needed to be made where to take the ship. Now, the ship was headed out of the English Channel southwest bound. So France would have been a logical conclusion, but the salvos on board actually gave an eyes-on and a first-hand opinion saying, if we continue driving into the prevailing seas and winds, then the stresses on the ship are going to be so much greater than if we turned around and had following winds and seas. So a decision was made to take the ship to Portland on the south coast of England. And you can see there on the slide, by today's standard, and this is only 15 years ago, 2,300 TEU. Now, today, the largest ship, I think, can take just shy of 24,000 TEU.
Yeah, 10 times.
So completely different order of magnitude. But another worry, obviously, on top of the amount of containers on board the ship, were the 3,500 tons of bunker fuel that could have obviously caused a lot of environmental damage if they were to come out of the ship. Now, whilst the ship was being towed towards Portland, the salvos on board actually reported that the ship was starting to break apart. So a quick decision needed to be made. What can we do with the ship? And I think on the operational level, it was, well, we need to ground it somewhere, because that way we prevent it breaking apart at sea, potentially spilling 3,500 tons of oil and 2,300 containers into the sea, causing large-scale environmental damage and a hazard to other shipping in the English Channel. So a quick decision was made, not an easy one, needless to say, that the ship should be grounded in Lyme Bay, which at the time the environmental advisors said, if the ship has to be grounded anywhere, then it shouldn't be Lyme Bay. Now, unfortunately, that was not an option to not ground it there, because it would have broken apart at sea. And I think when it comes to incidents like this, there's a mindset change required that goes from, in normal day-to-day decisions that we all make, it's usually, what's the best option here? Now, in cases like this, there are no best options. That's a completely different way of approaching your decision-making process. We are only looking at bad options. So we're not looking at best options here, it's only bad options. And out of all these, we want the least worst. And that was, in retrospect, even though, immediately afterwards, there were a lot of complaints that this was the wrong decision and so on. But even all the other regulators afterwards said, no, actually, that was the right decision. No, it wasn't a good decision, but it was the right decision at the time. And I think this incident really showed that what the role was created for was exactly how it worked, in that you had vested powers of decision-making at the highest level by a single individual who works with the information and advice given at the time, and being able to make it so in the overriding public interest. And then what's called a salvage control unit was established and worked out of the Coast Guard station in Weymouth. And yeah, like I said, by today's standard, this was a small ship, but it took over 900 days to remove everything that needed to be removing from the south coast of England. The top right picture there, it took almost 5 months to remove those containers. So now take that tenfold with the size of container ships that we have nowadays. I think I'll just skip over this one, but these are the kind of challenges I see at the moment, is that the ships are getting ever larger. There are fewer places of refuge. I'm not quite sure that it's fully thought through, what will happen if one of these ships on the right-hand side, that I think is currently the largest ship of its type. What are we going to do in an emergency? Working off the assumption that we're not going to have an emergency, I think that's what they learned about the Titanic at the time. So nobody, I don't think, wants to have a repeat of something like that. Equally, not just cargo, passenger carrying vessels, cruise ships, taking 9,000 people, including crew and passengers to the remotest of locations that simply could not facilitate taking 9,000 people, let alone 100. So those are technical challenges. But one of the other challenges that runs concurrent to this is, in my mind, that it's great that we have improved maritime safety to the degree that we have fewer and fewer incidents globally. But that carries with it, obviously, the risk that people who work in various roles in administrations and in industry have never really encountered any incident response. Now, that's a luxury problem, I admit, but when the incident happens and the balloon goes up, you want people who at least have a good degree of understanding of the parties that are involved, the challenges, and managing expectations. Because as we've seen from a few particularly wreck removals over the last 10 years, it takes years to remove these ships if they ground, particularly close to a country's shoreline. So on that happy note, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for having me. I'll now attempt to stop.
Jan, thank you. That was sorry, Stefan, that was fantastic. That was great. It will prompt some questions. I'm just going to try and share my screen and then we can crack into those. Right, I think that's where we are. Good, hopefully that is all clear. Questions I've got: what has happened with ports of refuge? Why did the, does anybody have a clear answer to that? Why would the Express Pearl bounce around from port to port quietly on fire? And why is that going to be reviewed? Would anyone have a clear answer to that? How ports of refuge are supposed to work? Or is that just something which IMO will end up looking at? Stefan, yeah.
Okay, obviously it wouldn't be right to comment on anyone's decisions.
No.
In this particular scenario, but I think in general terms, it's completely understandable how both administrations, and that might be neighboring administrations or consecutive neighboring administrations, don't, not in my backyard issue.
Yeah.
But we don't know the full ins and outs, so it's difficult to pass judgment, and it wouldn't be right. But in my mind, it's objective view is the only way how to make proper decisions.
Yeah.
And if that means getting somebody from the authority on board to assess what the risk is, and then potentially help or facilitate helping, I think that is the right approach, and that's certainly the approach we'd always advocate and conduct in the UK.
Jan, you've got your hand up.
Also in response, not only to your question but also the comments of Stefan, because the I think it was the Flaminia incident caused a lot of discussion in the European Union about how actually to organize that port of refuge is available. And what I understand from that discussion, actually, that there is a kind of allocation being obliged under the applicable European Union regulation or directive to appoint places of refuge, and actually that you have in advance an option where to go to. So I'm not aware of how that works in practice, but I think it is an issue how to manage that. So perhaps that Stefan has further views on that, but that will be my response to this one.
Stefan.
Yeah, thanks. 2 points. Obviously, it'd be extremely difficult for someone in the UK to comment on EU operational guidelines, but I feel I can, as it was the UK and my predecessor at the time, who I think was quite instrumental in helping set up and draft these EU operational guidelines, and they strongly advocate for independent assessment that is then shared with all parties, so as transparent as it possibly can be, in order to facilitate good decision making. But I think one of the core problems when it comes to places of refuge is simply the fact that there is no legal obligation on a coastal state to accommodate a ship. I think so anything stems from that, and so if we don't have that foundation, then there will always be more problems than there would be if we didn't have it. So
and is actually
absence,
also it aren't also there is the issue that a lot of vessels are getting so much larger that actually many of them require quite specialist handling just to get them in and out of port under normal circumstances, and they then need to be accommodated somewhere where the working of the port will be, or any risk can be managed appropriately without affecting the operation of the port.
Yeah, and you might be passing by a country that couldn't even take this size of ship we're talking about. So that's an additional challenge.
Yeah. And we've seen the issues, which I think not Ever Given, but Evergreen, I think it was, who ran aground just outside a port, and the problems that has caused have been quite immense. So I don't know, Sam, is that something which would fall under P&I?
Well, I think there we're talking more of a salvage scenario where a ship can be successfully refloated. So primarily the costs there would be for the hull and machinery and cargo underwriters, but we'd obviously be taking a very keen interest because of the potential exposures in relation to pollution. And if a ship like that can't be salvaged, cargo liabilities with the vast amounts of cargo that they can carry, and then also potentially wreck removal.
And as the nature of shipping changes, we seem to be seeing ships which are getting larger. They're now becoming more automated to reduce the size of the crews. And we're also going to throw in the mix soon a mixture of fuels fueling the vessels. It's all getting a bit scary, isn't it? I mean, I've seen ships being built now with a mixture of LNG and possibly hydrogen as their means of propulsion, and it's a long way from what we know, which touches on Stefan's point about skills and what we're used to dealing with. We build up a degree of embedded knowledge, but we're moving quite quickly into new worlds. Sam, you've got a comment on that?
I think that's right. But as I mentioned in my presentation, the P&I clubs have been around for a long time. The Standard Club's been around since 1884, and in that time we've seen lots of technological evolutions, and I think that the industry generally, not just P&I, has been quite good at very good actually at responding to change circumstances. And within Standard Club, for example, alternative fuels, which is one of the topics that you've mentioned, is something that we're keenly focused on, and have actually put together a dedicated panel to review that and assess what the risks might be for ship owners and clubs. So I'm confident ultimately that we'll be able to grip up on these new challenges.
And certainly at Interspill, there's quite a lot of talk within the technical conference, but also in the science workshops, talking about the risks of alternative fuels and how as responders or as an industry, we're going to deal with the incidents that may arise. I just wanted to throw the floor open to anybody else if they had any questions. I mean, anyone can talk now, and do talk if you have anything. But are there, while the audience thinking about that, any points of how we can accelerate the process of if you like, the ship owners? There is a tendency amongst ship owners sometimes to look at the bottom line rather than their responsibility to the environment. Stephen, you've seen in UK, we seem to have a mechanism whereby you can almost take control of the incident above the authority of the ship owner. Would that be right?
Yeah, we could, or whoever's in this room could, but the idea is obviously not to have to do that. Every incident I've ever worked on usually falls down at the first hurdle with the communication. Once you've got the communication established, things tend to go a lot easier. And I think that's why it's very important to engage with stakeholders outside of incidents. Now that's obviously extremely difficult when it comes to shipping. But Sam mentioned it earlier. We have the international group have various MOUs with states, the UK among them. And I think to have that is so valuable during incidents, because you can cut the entire introduction bit of, this is my responsibility, this is your responsibility, where everybody should know what their own responsibility is, and the expectation as a standard should be do as is your responsibility. Now, when that all works, it's brilliant. The problem is if you take some element or any one element out of the equation, it becomes that much more challenging. But communication, key piece, early stakeholder engagement in an incident, know who makes the decisions in the various organizations, that helps no end.
And trust, I guess. Sam, you had a hand up. You're on mute.
Sorry, Mark, you think
That's
after
right.
2 years I'd be a bit...
No, I still do this.
I think, within the clubs, we do an awful lot of work in relation to loss prevention, because we want to ensure ship owners who operate to high standards, and so that includes vetting at the time of binding or before we bind a risk, and then also in the event of incidents that members suffer, working with them afterwards to understand why and what's going to happen in the future to avoid a repeat of that. So there's a lot of work that goes on there, and just from a financial point of view, we're a mutual, so we're not for profit, but what that also means is that a member will be paying for a bad record. So if they have a bad record on the club, that will hit them in the pocket, because they will inevitably pay more premium for that. So there is actually a financial incentive as well for them to improve their record in that way.
Jan, you had your hand up.
Yes, please. I would like to add to this discussion that there are many states actually who do not have the facility to get this communication easily in place. Also because they don't have any experience at all how to deal with an incident. We have seen that in Mauritius with the Wakassia, Sri Lanka. Also recently, Cabo Verde approached us that actually a wreck was located on their shore and nobody is responding. It's partly also because they are not party to these conventions, which is what we try to promote actually, to get more engagement, because I know that the industry is from goodwill to invest in that, because it's works both ways. But when there is no knowledge and no, actually no strategy how to do that, I see it's happening that there is not a resolution. So I would like to address that concern. Thank you.
Well, we are in changing times, aren't we? And I think quite a lot is changing. But I think I just want to, come on, slides, move. I just want to thank you. I just want to flag up to those who are listening that we've got several other webinars on this series. The next is the 7th of June, which is container losses. And then that thorny subject we touched on earlier, alternative fuels and what they really mean, that's on the 15th of June. A week today, we've got a very popular one, marine debris and plastic pollution, to be followed on the 8th of June by emerging pollutants. All of the details of these webinars are on interspill.org. And if you've got any questions, you can always contact me, and that's my email address here. I just want to thank very much our three speakers. Sam Kendall Marsden from the Standard Club, that was really illuminating. Jan de Boer from the IMO, who really kept us grounded in the convention and the history of the convention, but also touched on why it's there. And Stefan Hennig, who's the SOS rep, thank you very much for that illumination you've given. I'm sure that SOS rep is something which many would wish would be replicated in more countries. And I think there will probably be an evolution towards that in many other countries over the near future. It certainly seems that with the forecast increase in shipping, and certainly the volumes which will be shipped by sea over the next 30 years, that actually shipping and salvage will be alive, and these issues will be current, fortunately, are hopefully not too many, and hopefully with good procedures and good management without too great a consequence. But we do see them arising, and that keeps responders, insurers, regulators, and people like SOSREP awake at night, worrying about what could happen when the wind is rattling on our windows. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for those who joined us. This is being recorded. I'll get the recording tomorrow. I'll edit it and take out my mistakes and leave everyone else's in. And I'll make sure it's up on interspill.org by the end of the week. But thank you very much indeed for attending, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And thank you again to our speakers. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.